Let's start, inshallah. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Salatu wassalam ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to enable this gathering to be in our scale of good deeds. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to reward you for the time that you spare for His sake. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to enable this gathering to be of benefit. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to enable us to exit from this gathering with hearts more steadfast on the path, more loving of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, more following of the Prophet alayhi salatu wassalam. Ameen ya Rabbil Alameen. And I want to start off with an apology for my delay. SubhanAllah, Maghrib took a little bit of time, and the time I was able to come and start. So SubhanAllah, but hopefully from next time, Maghrib will be a little bit earlier, so it'll give us more time, inshallah, to be on time. We'll start with the best of speech, inshallah. And of course, the best of speech is the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is verbatim the words of Allah. Kalamullah, verbatim, is from the Quran, or is the Quran. We have other words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in, for example, the form of a hadith Qudsi, which is known as a divine hadith, if you like. And that is the sayings of the Prophet ﷺ, where the Prophet, quotes Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but the words are from the Prophet ﷺ. So that is also the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but not verbatim, not word for word, right? But this, of course, the Quran is word for word, the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we'll start with the best of speech, inshallah. And we'll start with a verse that kind of touches on the topic of today, which is Halal and Haram. And it is a very important verse, subhanAllah, that often is neglected. And then we'll read the translation, inshallah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم الذين يتبعون الرسول النبي الأمي الذي يجدونه مكتوبا عندهم في التوراة والإنجيل يأمرهم بالمعروف وينهاهم عن المنكر ويحل لهم الطيبات ويحرم عليهم الخبائث ويضع عنهم إصرهم والأغلال التي كانت عليهم فالذين آمنوا به وعزروه ونصروه واتبعوا النور الذي أنزل معه أولئك هم المفلحون. صدق الله العظيم. This is in Surah Al-A'raf. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, the meaning of which, this is from the translation of the clear Quran, they are the ones who follow the messenger, the unlettered prophet, whose description they find in their Torah and the Gospel or the Injil. He commands them to do good, forbids them from evil, permits for them what is lawful, and forbids to them what is impure, and relieves them from their burdens and the shackles that bound them. Only those who believe in him, honor and support him, and follow the light sent down to him will be successful. This verse, of course, is, like I said, a very powerful verse, and it touches on perhaps the purpose of revelation. Why was the Prophet ﷺ, Muhammad ﷺ, the final messenger to humanity? Why was he sent, and what is the message all about? It tells us here that he, the Prophet ﷺ, commands us to do that which is good and forbids that which is evil. يَأْمُرُ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَيَنْهَى عَنِ الْمُنكَرِ, and permits what is lawful and what is good. يُحِلُّ لَهُمُ الطَّيِّبَاتِ, and forbids that which is evil, right? And the phrase used is وَيَنْهَاهُمْ عَنِ الْمُنكَرِ, right? So sorry, وَيُحَرِّمْ, now tahrim, right? يُحَرِّمُ عَلَيْهِمْ الْخَبَائِثِ, meaning that what is prohibited is al-khaba'ith, meaning that which is impure, that which is harmful, that which is dangerous, that which is evil, that which is vile. All of that is in that word khaba'ith, subhanAllah. And then not only that, but also relieves them from their burdens and the shackles that bound them. And وَيَضَعُ عَنْهُمْ إِصْرَهُمْ وَالْأَغْلَالَ الَّتِي كَانَتْ عَلَيْهِمْ. So this is interpreted in many different ways. One such way is that the shackles that was on the people was man-made shackles, because of their transgressions against each other. They shackled one another, they enslaved one another, they elevated, some people elevated their own ranks into the elite class, and there were other classes that were below them and that were, kind of put with burdens upon them. So Islam came to liberate these people and break these shackles and put everybody on an equal footing before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the interpretation I lean towards. Of course, there are other interpretations as well, but this is the one that I lean towards. And then, of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says here, فَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا بِهِ, those that actually believe in this messenger and believe in this message, honor it and support it, and they follow the guidance in the form of the light that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has revealed, they are the successful ones. And we hope to be amongst them. Ameen ya Rabbil Alameen. All right, that is a very fitting introduction to the topic that we are going to try to cover, inshallah. But I mean, it's not an easy one. Definitely one that perhaps deserves hours upon hours. But we'll try to be succinct and try to be short, inshallah. And that is really to dive into one of the most interesting books ever written in our modern history. And that is Al-Halal and Haram fi Islam, written by Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi. And so it perhaps is fitting to kind of also maybe read a short bio about the Sheikh, like who is Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, right? He's the author of the book. And so, that's an interesting kind of question, like who is he? And of course, there are many different, a lot of information about the Sheikh. He recently passed away, subhanAllah, just 2 years ago. And he's an Egyptian scholar. He was based in Dawah, Qatar for the longest time. He was the chairman of the International Union of Muslim Scholars. And he, subhanAllah, has a wealth of books and a wealth of like YouTube videos and interviews and lectures and khutb. And subhanAllah, he really did a very large impact on the Muslim community and the world at large. And I encourage anybody that's kind of interested in knowing more about Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi is to check a very interesting video by Sheikh Yasir al-Qadi. So Sheikh Yasir al-Qadi, kind of commemorating Sheikh Yusuf, he made a video after the passing away of Sheikh Yusuf. Sheikh Yasir did a video called The Life, Legacy and Thought of Sheikh Dr. Yusuf al-Qaradawi. So I encourage you to check out that video. It's not really long, it's maybe an hour or so, but it's in English, and it kind of goes through the life and the legacy of Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi. Very, very much worth listening to and checking out, just to know who is the scholar that we're reading the book for. And we're reading this book and commenting, inshallah. And of course, I want you to comment as well. So if you have comments, reflections, thoughts, questions, concerns, feel free to, interrupt. Feel free to, put it in the comments. Feel free to share your thoughts. I don't want this to be, a one-way street. I want to hear from you. I want you to share what you think and what you feel about things as well, inshallah, so that it becomes this, an engaging, opportunity, inshallah. All right, that said, we will start with the intro. And this is the introduction that was written for the book when it was originally published. It was published, I think, in if I'm not mistaken, in the 70s, maybe in the 80s. So it was quite a while ago when it was first published. And this is from the intro to the original book. So, the author kind of highlights, Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, highlights why he wrote this book. And so he says that there was a project that was pioneered or spearheaded by Al-Azhar University. Back then, the Islamic University of Al-Azhar in Egypt. They pioneered or spearheaded a project to write a series of simple books. The idea was not to write something complicated. The idea was to write something that is simple, uses simple common language that is easy to read, easy to understand. And the purpose of it really was to educate non-Muslims about Islam, right? And so he says, the author, that we found as we were preparing that there were so many examples of Muslims that were unfortunately warping the understanding of the deen, misunderstanding what Islam is all about. And so he asks the question, he says, if that is the situation of Muslims, then what about non-Muslims, right? Like if Muslims are unable to understand Islam properly, then what about non-Muslims who unfortunately receive a very negative stereotype about Islam through media at the time? Of course, there was no social media back then, but through media and through, the attacks of Orientalists and through the attacks and the efforts really that were funded by the colonizer in an effort to, kind of, as the word goes, tashwish, right? Wa tashwih al-Islam, which translates to the vilification, right? And dehumanization of Islam and Muslims. So he says he found out that, as he was researching and preparing for this book, that he had to, address all of these things. So he wanted to do something interesting in this book. And then he says in the book as well that there were two types of Muslims when it came to researching Islam and studying Islam. There were one group, he says, خَطَفَ أَبْصَارَهُمْ ضَرِيقَ الْمَدَنِيَّةِ الْغَرْبِيَّةِ. There's a group of people that were blinded by the light of Western modernism and Western thought, right? And so one group of people that are studying Islam, and they may be even scholars of Islam, they may have a wealth of knowledge when it comes to Islam, but they were very much westernized, very much modernized, very much, unfortunately, losing the true kind of essence of our deen. And so he says this about them. He says that they, kind of unfortunately established a large idol that they're following. And this large idol became Western thought, Western lifestyle, the way the people lived in the West. They were so impressed by Western technology and Western advancements that they became followers of the West, right? So they're studying Islam and kind of trying to dissect it in a way using the Western prism, right? So that's what he says about them. This is the first group. He says that, they would do things that, was against Islam. Like, for example, saying incest is okay, being alone with the opposite gender is okay. That a woman is equal to a man. The feminist ideas that were out there. Wearing gold and silk for men is okay. Things like that, right? So they started to bring about these things and kind of try to change them. Things that are known to be not part of our deen, and so we'll touch upon them later on, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala permits. And so he quotes a verse in the Quran, and he says, وَلَوْ تَبَعَ الْحَقُّ أَهْوَاءَهُمْ لَفَسَدَتِ السَّمَاوَاتُ وَالْأَرْضُ وَمَنْ فِيهِنْ. So he quotes a verse, the author. He says that if truth was to follow the whims and desires of people, then heavens and the earth and everything in between would have been corrupted. Right? When whims and desires of people is followed, heavens and the earth and everything in between will be corrupted. So he says this is group one. The second group, he says, is of people that have been, kind of very rigid in terms of certain opinions when it comes to halal and haram. And they became very stringent, right, when it came to Islam. And they thought that is what Islam is all about, right? So they would never, kind of clear away from their opinions, despite perhaps valid difference of opinion on a matter. And so he says here that they became very rigid, very stringent, and if they are asked about, the rulings when it comes to certain things, they would immediately, what's closest to their tongue is to say haram, right? And then he says that these people, the author says, these people, they forgot that, saying haram easily is actually not the acts of the Salaf, the people, our predecessors, the Salaf Salih, meaning the Sahaba, the Tabi'een, the Tabi'at Tabi'een, the righteous predecessors that are the closest to the deen and closest to applying Islam in their lives and closest to the Prophet ﷺ, they didn't jump to haram, right? It was not an easy thing to say or easy judgment to cast, right? And so he says here, لم يكونوا يطلقون الحرام إلا ما علم تحريمه. They would not say haram except what they are certain of it being haram, قطعا, right, without ambiguity. وما عدا ذلك, anything other than that, قالوا فيه نكره. Anything other than that, if it wasn't certainly, unequivocally known to be haram, the predecessors would say nakrah, meaning we dislike it, right? أو لا نحب, or we don't like it, right? Or other expressions like this. So basically, he's trying to say, the author, is that these are the two groups that were predominant at the time. And then he says, I tried not to be from either of these groups. And so I will never take, the West as my idol, because of course he says, رضيت بالله ربا وبالإسلام دينا وبمحمد رسولا. Because I've taken as my Lord, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Islam as my way of life. Deen here, by the way, does not mean religion, it means way of life. And I've taken Muhammad as my messenger. And so after that, I cannot take the West as my guide or my, the prism or the filter with which I see the world, or the lenses through which I see the world. No, right? And then he said, I also did not want to be somebody that blindly follows the opinions of previous people, right? There were previous scholars that dealt with matters and dealt with issues that was pertinent for their times. And some of them were correct and some of them were incorrect. And they had different circumstances and different situations. And he did not want to be, he says about himself, did not want to be a blind follower. I wanted to be able to look at the evidence myself and to evaluate the situation and the circumstances myself, right? And so this is the kind of the methodology of the author. I wanted to kind of point this out, why because it's important to recognize like where is the author coming from and what is this book all about. And then he says, al-halal wal-haram is known, what is permissible and what is impermissible is known from old times, right? It's known from the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Although people have differed, right, with how much is haram and the kinds and the reasons behind what is haram and what is impermissible. And so he says this is something that even preceded Islam, right? So what is permissible and what is impermissible? What are the laws that are put in place by different societies? That's even before Islam, right? And unfortunately, he says many people have attached to what is permissible and what is impermissible superstitions. He says it's kind of these asaltir legends and stories of old, but until Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent his message to humanity, and the message from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala came to rid humanity from these superstitions, from these lies and stories, and from these legends, and to put a true criteria with which justice can be identified, truth can be identified, correct can be identified, and falsehood can be identified, and lies can be identified. And so the criteria, al-Furqan is one of the names of the Quran, by the way, which means the separator, that which is used to separate between truth and falsehood, that which is used to clarify between truth and falsehood. And so that's why the verse that we recited at the beginning, right? He quotes part of it as well, and how that this is the revelation that was sent to the Prophet ﷺ, and it was to make clear what is impermissible, to make it impermissible, to clarify its impermissibility, and to make clear that which is permissible and that which is considered good and permissible and halal. And so he says here, again, we're kind of just going through the intro just to, again, figure out what the author and where he's coming from and what's this book all about. He says the idea, the concept of halal and haram in Islam is a simple concept, right? It is part of the greater amana, the greater trust that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala entrusted upon us. This trust that the heavens and the earth refused and the mountains refused to carry. They refused to carry this amana. وَأَشْفَقْنَ مِنْهَا, as the Quran says, and they felt that they are too humble, too enable or unable to carry such a trust and such a weight on their shoulders. These other creations, right? The heavens and the earth and the mountains. وَحَمَلَهَا الْإِنسَانِ, but the human being carried this trust. And he says here, this is أَمَانَةُ التَّكَالِيفِ الْإِلَهِيَّةِ. This is the trust of upholding the obligations, the divine obligations Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made obligatory upon us, and to carry the responsibility of khilafatullahi fil ard, the stewardship of this earth, right? To be the stewards of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on this earth. So, if you've ever heard me talk before, I usually mention this concept, the idea that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala announced the creation of Adam alayhi salam, he said, Inni ja'ilun fil ardi khalifa. I'm going to place on this earth a viceroy, a vice-regent, or a steward. These are all different translations for the same word of khalifa. So each and every one of us is khalifatullah fil ard. And so he says here that the responsibility of being, the viceroy or steward of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on this earth, that is part of the amana, part of the trust that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala entrusted upon our shoulders. And so he says here, تلك المسؤولية التي على أساسها يثاب الإنسان ويعاقب. This responsibility is, based on it and how responsible we are in upholding it, we are either rewarded or punished on the day of judgment. And by the way, maybe a small side note, I was going to have slides prepared, but I couldn't finish them on time. But what I'll do, inshallah, is that I will try to have them ready and sent to you before next session, inshallah, so you can kind of have them as a reference. So I apologize for not having the slides ready. I actually had an exam today, and so I got really busy. Anybody want to interject at any point in time? Feel free to, like I said, put in the comments, to raise your hand if you want to share a comment or share a reflection or share a thought, inshallah. Feel free to do that anytime. Okay, the author continues in his introduction. He says, لِمَا كَانَ الْحَلَالُ وَالْحَرَامُ. Why is there a need to have al-halal wal-haram? Why don't people just get, let loose, let them decide for themselves, let them, discover trial and error, let them, go through things on their own. And so he says here that it is actually for many reasons. One of which is, it is part of our trials on this earth, right? That everybody that is mukallaf, anybody that has the responsibility, right, that has this have reached the age of responsibility, the age of becoming responsible, part of our ibtila, part of our trials in this world, is to uphold what is halal and haram, and to understand these concepts and to adopt them in our lives. So that's part of it. But he also says that it distinguishes us from other creatures, right? It distinguishes us from animals, distinguishes us from angels. So he says from animals, it distinguishes us because they simply follow their whims and desires. It distinguishes us from angels who have no whims or desires, right? So the angels obey the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala without, fault, without hesitation. وَيَفْعَلُونَ مَا يُؤْمَرُونَ, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says about them. They do what they're commanded. But animals, they don't have the intellect, they don't have the ability to decide what to do or what not to do, or to, they don't have the consciousness that we have. And so they're simply following their desires. So we are distinguished from them, the angels and the animals, by having what is known as al-halal and haram, what is permissible and what is impermissible. And here I'm reminded of a saying that is attributed to Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anhu. He says that when a human being, when a believer adopts the commandments of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and applies the halal and haram in their lives, then when they do so wholeheartedly, they become better than angels, right? When they abandon the halal and haram, then they become worse than animals. And the reason he says this, Ali ibn Abi Talib, if of course this is authentic, is that basically when we uphold the commandments of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we are struggling against our nafs. We're struggling against our whims and desires. We're trying to uphold our deen as best as possible and to do that which is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And as such, we are, not just abiding by the commandments of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we are choosing to do so. And that requires patience, perseverance, strength, fortitude, all of which that can be, if we use the tools Allah has blessed us with, we can gain that strength. We can gain that fortitude. We can gain this patience, right? Some of the tools, for example, is righteous companionship. Halaqat like this, attending, events like these that we can, kind of share and reflect and ponder together. And being in a companionship and that is righteous, that reminds us of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And also our own dhikr and connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So these are, different tools to attain patience. When we do, use these tools, we attain the patience necessary to adopt and apply the rulings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in our lives. He says that makes us better than angels because the angels don't need such patience. They don't go through such trials. For them, it is not even a choice, right? They don't have that blessing while we do. So in the eyes of Ali ibn Abi Talib, it makes us better than angels. But what about the other side? He says that it makes us worse than animals when we neglect these commandments and when we ignore them or dismiss them or set them aside or go against them. Why? Because then we're following our whims and desires, and that's exactly what animals do. But animals don't have a choice in the matter. We chose to be like animals, and so that makes us even worse than the animals, according to Ali ibn Abi Talib. Sorry, just a side note. And here, of course, we are reminded that this deen, the author, this is kind of continuing in the introduction. He says that this deen, this way of life, is rahmatun ilahiyatun shamilah. It is a complete, holistic mercy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for His creation. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ. We sent you but to be mercy to the whole world or to all worlds. And the Prophet is reported to have said, alayhi salatu wasalam, he says, إِنَّمَا أَنَا رَحْمَةٌ مُهْدَاهِ. I am but mercy with guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we recognize that there is mercy, right, that comes with the commandments of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They may be seen as stringent, that, do this, don't do that, but they actually are mercy for humanity and mercy for the world at large and mercy for us as servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so these are just a few comments and notes from the intro by Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi in his book, and he concludes the introduction by saying that this was an opportunity presented to me to be able to contribute in this direction, and trust that was entrusted to me by the administration at Al-Azhar University, and I hope and wish that I live up to this responsibility and that I achieve what is required. And I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to enable this book to be of benefit, and that Allah guides me to that which is true and hits the mark, whether in speech or action, and that Allah protects me from deviation and from deviating from the path, and that Allah enables us to reach guidance. Innahu sami'ud du'a. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that hears our supplications. I mentioned this was in the 70s or the 80s. It turns out it was done in 1960, right? So this intro, now it's dated here, I see it in front of me, was in 1960. So that's when the book was actually first published. It was published many times later after that, subhanAllah. So we're studying a book that is, not age old, like not ancient old, but quite old still, but written still in our modern time. Like I said, Shaykh Yusuf al-Qaradawi passed away actually just 2 years ago, subhanAllah. All right. Now we have the section called Ta'rifat, which means introductions or definitions, sorry. So al-halal, the first definition, he says, it is what is made permissible, right? So basically it is not impermissible. It is something that has been made permissible by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that we're allowed to do and allowed to attain. Al-haram, it is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala unequivocally made impermissible, right? Whoever actually, attains or does anything that is impermissible, anything that is haram, they have disobeyed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and as such are worthy of punishment from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the day of judgment. But they also may be liable to attain punishment in this life as well. Okay, so that's the definition of al-haram. And then he has one last definition, al-makruh. What is al-makruh? Makruh could be translated as disliked, the disliked. He says, it is what has been made impermissible by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but Allah did not stress it, did not stress the impermissibility of it. And so this has been called makruh, and it is less than that which is haram. It's less than the impermissible per se, okay? In degree, in status, in level. And the one that commits a makruh will not have a punishment as the one that commits al-haram would. However, he says, those that prolong in attaining the makruh, prolong and keep doing al-makruh, and they have this nonchalant attitude about it, then perhaps this will kind of embolden somebody to fall into haram, because al-makruh is kind of like very close to haram. It's advised not to attain it, recommended not to fall into it. But whoever does so nonchalant, with a nonchalant attitude and doesn't really care, and is like, oh, this is not haram, bro, like take it easy. That attitude that is kind of has a bit of not caring attitude, then they are very close to falling into haram. So this is the words of the author when it comes to define these 3 levels. By the way, in addition to these 3 levels, there are 2 other levels. So we have 5 levels when it comes to fiqh. He doesn't mention the other 2 because perhaps he doesn't want to focus on them too much here. But the other levels that are mentioned in books of fiqh in general are what is known as al-mubah and al-mandub. Okay, so what is al-mubah and al-mandub? Al-mubah is what is allowed, but it's like it's something that you're not rewarded for doing, you're not punished for not doing. Like it's kind of like, if you do it, good for you. If you don't do it, good for you too. Like there's no, it doesn't fall in either direction. It's kind of neutral, right? And then you have al-mandub. Al-mandub is what is recommended to do. Now, if you don't do what is recommended, you're not punished. You're not sinful. But when you do it, you are rewarded, right? And then you have al-wajib, right? So he kind of, used al-halal to just put certain categories in it. So just telling you, different categorization of scholars, these are all done by scholars, right? These categorizations. And of course, these categorizations are based on the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. All right, that brings us now to chapter 1. And the chapter is titled Principles of Islam Related to Al-Halal and Haram. Okay, so principles in Islam related to Al-Halal or Al-Haram, to what is permissible and what is impermissible. All right, so Bismillah. Now, he says here that before Islam, people deviated. They deviated from that which is permissible. They deviated from that which is impermissible. They violated these rulings that they had. And there was what he calls ittiraban fahishan. There was this kind of confusion. There was this loss of recognition, not knowing what is actually wrong, what is actually right? There's confusion when it comes to these things amongst people before Islam. فَأَحَلُّوا الْحَرَامَ الْخَبِيثِ. So they made permissible that which is dangerous, that which is harmful. وَحَرَّمُوا الْحَلَالَ الطَّيِّبِ. And they made impermissible that which is actually good, right? And so he says that was the situation of the world, not just Arabia, but the whole world before Islam. And he says that revelation has been sent to people to correct these understandings, to guide people to a true standard of living and a style of living that is conducive for happiness in this world and the next, and that is in line with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pleased with. But then people deviated, right? People deviated from these revelations. So, things popped up, right? Like, for example, he gives examples. He says what is known as al-Brahmiyya al-Hindiyya. So, that classism that existed in the in India at the time, right? And kind of still exists till this day, subhanAllah, right? This idea that, people are born into classes and born into certain, there's the untouchables, and then there's the Brahmins, and then there's this, and there's that, right? So this idea of classifying people according to what family they're born into, and that is a level or class that they have to live with for the rest of their lives. So this is something that he says, is, one extreme example of deviation. Another example, he says, al-Rahbaniyya al-Masihiyya. So Christian monasticism, right? This idea of being a monk that sheds aside worldly gains or pleasures of all sorts, and everything becomes haram, and they live only between, their church and their monastery, and between doing worship, and that's it, right? So he says that these are all different ways of life that exist and that existed, and that basically, is transgression, right? It is transgression against the self, it is transgression against people, and it leads to so much injustices and so much pain and suffering. And so there's also, he says, certain ideologies that existed in Persia at the time. He calls it, the idea of everything is permissible, right? And so people can take whatever, people can do whatever, nothing is impermissible. There is no laws, no rules, nothing is prohibited, everything is open, everything is free, everything is attainable, right? And so basically nothing is sacred. And this, kind of is also a deviation. And then he talks about Ummat al-Arab, meaning the Arabian Peninsula and the ignorance that existed at the time. And so, there were actions as well that were made permissible despite their impermissibility and the damage that they cause, such as drinking wine, such as interests, such as usury, such as the degradation of women, such as, and he says all of this comes from shayateen al-insi wal jinn. All of this comes from the shaitan and from the cronies of the shaitan, whether they be human or jinn. They're the ones that are promoting such lifestyles all over the world and such deviations all over the world. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-An'am, وَكَذَلِكَ زَيَّنَ لِكَثِيرٍ مِنَ الْمُشْرِكِينَ قَتْلَ أَوْلَادِهِمْ شُرَكَاؤُهُمْ لِيُرْدُوهُمْ وَلِيَلْبِسُوا عَلَيْهِمْ دِينَهُمْ. Which, I'm going to read the translation from the clear Quran, but basically it talks about the even murder of one's children, right? SubhanAllah, like this is something that existed at the time and exists till this day. Like the idea of murdering your own children, for what reason? They give it different names today. They call it abortion, but it's the same kind of concept. So here, the translation is likewise, the pagans' evil associates have made it appealing to them to kill their own children, only leading to their destruction as well as confusion in their faith. Right? So this is the portion of the verse that the author quotes, and so this is an example. And so, he says Islam has come, and it has, the people in the world were in a state of misguidance, a state of where they have made permissible that which is evil and made impermissible that which is good. And so the first thing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala kind of instilled in the hearts of the believers is to correct their hearts, their souls, their understandings, their recognitions, and their higher kind of concepts. And then upon all of this, the idea of what is halal and haram became established. So he says, فَرَدَّ الْأُمُورِ إِلَى نِصَابِهَا. All matters were returned to their rightful place. All balances were set up, right? Justice and balance were put in place. So, and this is Ummat al-Islam. And so Ummat al-Islam, or the Ummah of Muslims and the Ummah of believers, became something that corrected, the misguidance of those that misguided and the deviation of those that deviated, whether, right or left, he says. Ummatan wasata. Ummat al-Islam is a balanced nation. as described by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, خَيْرَ أُمَّةٍ أُخْرِجَتْ لِلنَّاسِ, the best ummah delivered to mankind. So now he deals with the principles. The first principle, he says, now we're diving into the context or the meat, if you like, of the book. Principle number 1. الأصل في الأشياء الإباحة. الأصل في الأشياء الإباحة, which means the original status or the original, ruling in matters is permissibility. Permissibility. So he says everything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created in this world is permissible, unless you have clear text and scripture or command from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that says that it is impermissible. Right? هو الذي خلق لكم ما في الأرض جميعا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that He has created for you, so everything that is in the earth has been created for you. وسخر لكم ما في السماوات وما في الأرض جميعا منه. Everything in the heavens and in the earth has been subjugated for you, all of it from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So, and numerous verses like this that scholars have used to deduce this principle. This principle. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created everything and created things and made it subjugated to the human being to use the things that are created in a way that is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? وإنما حرم جزئيات منها لسبب وحكمة سنذكرها بعد. But some parts of that which is created, parts, right, has been made impermissible for a reason and for a wisdom that we will mention later on. So he says here that the circle of that which is impermissible has been reduced significantly by Islam. Islam made that which is impermissible very small, a small circle. He says ضيقا شديدا, right? Really small and narrow, kind of that which is impermissible. واتسعت دائرة الحلال, but the circle of that which is permissible is very large and expansive. Right? So the impermissible is a small set of things. That which is permissible is much larger. And so he says that the scripture that is unequivocal and clear-cut in matters of prohibition, in matters of the impermissible, is very little. Very little. قليلة جدا. Very little. And he says here, وما لم يجيء نص بحله أو حرمته فهو باق على أصل الإباحة وفي دائرة العفو الإلهي. He says that what doesn't have scripture about, then it actually stays in the natural state that it is what? That it is permissible. Right? And he says it is actually in what is known as دائرة العفو الإلهي. It is in the circle of that which is forgiven by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so in a hadith, the Prophet is reported to have said, and this is narrated in al-Hakim and made authentic by many scholars, including al-Bazar. It goes as follows: ما أحل الله في كتابه فهو حلال. What Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made permissible in His book is permissible. وما حرم فهو حرام. And what is made impermissible, it is impermissible. وما سكت عنه فهو عفو. And what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was quiet about, then He is forgiving. فأقبلوا أو فاقبلوا من الله عافيته. So accept from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala His forgiveness. فإن الله لم يكن لينسى شيئا. For Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would not to forget anything. And then وَمَا كَانَ رَبُّكَ نَسِيًّا, the verse in Surah Maryam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says وَمَا كَانَ رَبُّكَ نَسِيًّا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not forgetful. And so Salman al-Farisi, he narrates سئل رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم عن السمن والجبن والغراء. So the Prophet was once asked about certain things, right? About cheese and about butter and about ghee, right? So he was asked about these things. فقال, so the Prophet then said عليه الصلاة والسلام, الحلال ما أحل الله في كتابه. Al-halal is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made permissible in His book. Okay? وَالْحَرَامُ مَا حَرَّمَ اللَّهُ فِي كِتَابِهِ. And what is impermissible or what is haram is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made impermissible in His book. وَمَا سَكَتَ عَنْهُ فَهُوَ مِمَّا عَفَى لَكُمْ. What Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was quiet about, then it is what is forgiven for you. Right? So this is in Sunan al-Tirmidhi and also in Sunan al-Majah and in Mustadrak al-Hakim. So these are books of hadith. And so he says here, the Prophet did not answer them specifically about these specific questions. Like the specific questions that they asked about was, ghee and butter and cheese. He didn't specifically mention them in this answer. But he instead referred the Sahaba and referred the people asking this question to what? To a principle. And the principle is the way for us all to know what is permissible and what is impermissible, what is haram and what is halal. So it is, enough to know what is impermissible by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what is made haram, and so anything other than that becomes halal and tayyiba. These are the words of the author. Right? So anything other than that becomes halal, meaning permissible, and good. And in another hadith, this is in Ad-Darqutni, another book of hadith, the Prophet is reported to have said the following: Inna Allah farada fara'id fala tudayyuha. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made obligatory certain obligations, so do not neglect them. وَحَدَّ حُدُودًا فَلَا تَعْتَدُوهَا. And he drew borders, so do not cross these borders. وَحَرَّمَ أَشْيَاءً فَلَا تَنْتَهِكُوهَا. And he made impermissible certain things, so do not violate these impermissible actions. وَسَكَتَ عَنْ أَشْيَاء رَحْمَةً بِكُمْ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was quiet about certain matters out of his mercy towards you. غَيْرَ نِسْيَانٍ, not out of forgetfulness. فَلَا تَبْحَثُوا عَنْهَا. So do not search for it. And so he says here that the author, after quoting this hadith, he says, I'd like to, kind of point out something important, and that is permissibility. Permissibility, something to be permissible, is not limited to things, right? It's not just limited to things or material things that we touch. It also includes actions, right? Al-af'al wa tasarrufat, actions and behaviors that is outside of the matters of worship, right? Outside the matters of worship. So basically not in the acts of worship. And so he says, it is what we call, the scholars of fiqh call al-adat or al-mu'amalat, meaning the habits or the routines, or al-mu'amalat, the actions related to interactions with others. فَالْأَصْلُ فِيهَا عَدَمُ التَّحْرِيم. The original, kind of ruling when it comes to these is, permissibility. Right? وَعَدَمَ التَّقْيِيد, and not to limit things إِلَّا مَا حَرَّمَهُ Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, except that which is impermissible or made impermissible by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَقَدْ فَصَّلَ لَكُمْ مَا حَرَّمَ عَلَيْكُمْ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala detailed for you that which he made impermissible upon you. And it says this verse, which is in Surah Al-An'am, it is generic in its understanding. It covers things, material things, and also actions and behaviors. He says this is opposite of al-ibadat, meaning the acts of worship or rituals of worship. He says it is matters of our deen and how we worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay? And so he says nothing can be introduced into our acts of worship, into our rituals of worship, except that which we have, clear scripture and verse in the Quran or hadith of the Prophet ﷺ about. And he quotes a hadith, Sahih hadith, which is mutafaqun alayh, which is in Sahih Bukhari and Muslim, which says, "Man ahdatha fi amrina ma laysa minhu fahuwa radd." Whoever introduces into this matter something that is not in it, then it is rejected. He says this is referring to our ibadat, our rituals of worship. And so he says here that the kind of the essence of our deen, of our way of life, to be in accordance to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the essence of it are two matters. أَلَا يُعْبَدْ إِلَّا اللَّهِ, that only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is worshipped. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the only one that is worshipped. وَلَا يُعْبَدُ إِلَّا بِمَا شَرَعَ, and the way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is worshipped is the way that He subhanahu wa ta'ala made obligatory upon us, or kind of set for us. Right? فَمَنِ ابْتَدَعَ عِبَادَةً مِنْ عِنْدِهِ, whoever innovates a way of worshipping from their own, it is misguidance and it is rejected, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the only one who has the right to establish how He is to be worshipped. But what about adat, routine actions in our lives? What about mu'amalat? What about the interactions that we have with people? As for that, this was not kind of set by the Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Instead, people are the ones that set them up. People kind of, came to certain conclusions and certain experiences on how they can deal with each other, certain rules about engagement, certain interactions, right? But then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala came to correct them and to purify them, and to, he says here, مُصَحِّحًا وَمُعَدِّلًا وَمُهَذِّبًا. Musahih means to correct it. Mu'addil meaning to, kind of return it on track. ومهذبة, meaning to put what is known as tahdib in it, meaning so that it follows certain ethics and etiquettes that is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. To remove all kinds of fasad and harm, all kinds of corruption and harm and evil from it. Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah is reported to have said the following. He says, إن تصرفات العباد من الأقوال والأفعال نوعان. The actions of servants, is two types. The actions of servants, meaning people, is of two types. The actions and words. So the words, the speech, and the actions of people is two types. عبادات يصلح بها دينهم, acts of worship that kind of purifies their way of life. وعادات يحتاجون إليها في دنياهم, and routine actions that they need in their day-to-day lives. This is the words of whom? Of Ibn Taymiyyah. He says, فباستقراء أصول الشريعة نعلم أن العبادات التي أوجبها الله أو أحبها لا يثبت الأمر بها إلا بالشرع. He says, by reading the sources of our deen, meaning the reading the Quran and reading the Seerah of the Prophet and reading the Sunnah of the Prophet and reading the Hadith of the Prophet, by reading these sources, usul al-Sharia, right, the roots of our Sharia, we find out and we come to the conclusion that ibadat, the acts of worship, the rituals of worship that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made obligatory upon us, or the acts of worship that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves for us to attain, right? So the nawafil, extra acts of worship, لا يثبت الأمر بها إلا بالشرع. It does not, it doesn't become, acceptable except through the Sharia that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed. وأما العادات, he continues, but as for routine actions, it is what people have routinely lived with and have come up with in their dunya from that which they need, which varies from time to time and place to place. وَالْأَصْلُ فِيهِ عَدَمُ الْحَظْرِ, and the original ruling when it comes to it is that you don't make it impermissible. فَلَا يَحْضَرُ مِنْهُ إِلَّا مَا حَضَّرَهُ اللَّهُ سُبْحَانَهُ وَتَعَالَى. You can only make impermissible that which Allah made impermissible when it comes to routine actions and interactions. وذلك لأن الأمر والنهي هما شرع الله, because what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands and what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prohibits, that is the sharia of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is the revelation and the guidance that comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. والعبادة, and acts of worship, has to be from these matters. فما لم يثبت أنه مأمور به فكيف كيف يحكم عليه بأنه محظور. If something is not proven to be commanded to do, then how can you say that it is impermissible? Right. So this is Ibn Taymiyyah, and quoted by Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi in his book. Any questions or comments at this point? Okay, excellent question. So question is, what does it mean to not search for that which Allah has not made permissible or impermissible? So the searching here is not meaning that, it does not mean not to search for answers to our questions. Like, let's say somebody is about to embark on a certain decision or a certain aspect in their lives. Should they ask? Should they search? Absolutely, they should ask and search. But where are they searching and asking? They're searching the Quran, they're searching the Sunnah of the Prophet, they're asking Ahl al-Dhikr, the people of remembrance, people of knowledge, the scholars. That's whom they're asking, and the people of knowledge are supposed to give them answers based on the Quran and the Sunnah. So not to search, meaning beyond that. Right? So beyond that, we're not supposed to search for things. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not say that something is haram, it's not in the Quran and the Sunnah, then we shouldn't search outside of that. Our frame of reference is the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet. Right? So beyond that, we shouldn't be searching. That's the way I understood it. All right, good, mashallah. And if any other questions pop up, please, like I said, feel free to put them, in the chat, or raise your hand and share them out loud, inshallah. Okay, there's a question here. Bani Israel, when they kept asking about the characteristics of the cow, that's a very good example, right? A very good example. The example, by the way, of the cow that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered Bani Israel, the Israelites, to slaughter, is a very interesting example, because at the beginning, Musa alayhi salam said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded you and tadhbahu baqarah, to slaughter a cow. No specifics were given. The color, the shape, the size, the age, the whereabouts, all of that was not given. And scholars say, had he slaughtered a cow immediately, any cow, it would have sufficed, right? Because specifics were not given as to what age, color, size, all of that, right? But they kept on asking and asking and asking. They wanted specifics. They wanted to know these specifics. And so, all of this is mentioned in the Quran in a bit of a, there's condemnation in the tone that the story is mentioned, that they delayed their abiding by the commandments of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that they wanted everything to be specified, everything to be very detailed, everything. They didn't, rush to obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They were postponing the obedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, really using the details as an excuse. And so that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, like they were coming close to not even doing that. Like, even given all the specifics, they were close to not obeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's a very good example of how sometimes, this is the type of questioning that is, kind of frowned upon. The question that goes beyond what is revealed, goes beyond what is commanded, right? We should limit ourselves to what is commanded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and kind of recognize this position, right? So this is a good example of that. All right, so we are very close to finishing principle number 1. We'll try to, dive into principle number 2, inshallah, in a little bit. Principle number 1, to conclude, he says, al-bay'u, meaning selling, wal-hiba, meaning gifting, wal-ijara, meaning to rent, and other routine actions that people need in their day-to-day lives, like eating, drinking, wearing clothes. He says that the Sharia, the guidance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, by the way, the word Sharia means the legislation, right? The law that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed, right? This law that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed came في هذه العادات بالآداب الحسنة. It came and spoke about these routine actions to be following, good behavior, good ethics, good etiquettes. And so it prohibited that which is corruptive, that which is evil. And it made obligatory, it made, wajib, it made, kind of, something that is incumbent, something that must be attained, that which is necessary. And it also made makruh, right? So it made makruh, that's the third category that was defined by the author, right? That which is disliked, that which is recommended not to do, certain aspect. But he also says, wastahabbat, and it made recommended, ma fihi maslahatun rajiha, that which brings about goodness for the people. In when it comes to these adat, these routine actions, وَمَقَادِيرِهَا وَصِفَاتِهَا. And مقدار الشيء is the level to which this is done, right? So there are routine actions, and then there are different measures or levels as to how much of it is done, and then its description, right? So when these routine actions bring about maslahatun rajiha, meaning goodness to people and goodness to all those around, then this is preferred. So he says this is preferred. Istahabbat, meaning it's preferred by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's rewarded to do it. So this is one of the things. He says, وَالنَّاسُ يَتَبَايَعُونَ وَيَسْتَأْجِرُونَ كَيْفَ يَشَاءُونَ. He says that people, buy and sell and rent, and the Sharia did not prohibit this. And they eat and they drink as that which they want. And the Sharia did not prohibit that, except that little haram aspect, right, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put in place, right? And so this is, by the way, this is not the author speaking, this is the continuation of Ibn Taymiyyah's quote, so my bad. We were still in the quote of Ibn Taymiyyah, if you remember. So Ibn Taymiyyah is continuing with this, and so he says basically that the Sharia came and prohibited that which is evil, that which is harmful, and it's a small portion of that which we are allowed. And then the author quotes a very interesting hadith, and it is in, he says, في الصحيح عن جابر ibn Abdullah كنا, so maybe let's not mention this example, it's okay, you can check it out on your own later, but it's just an example that there were certain things that we used to do in our day-to-day lives, certain practices we would do, and we used to continue to do it and waiting for the nahi. If it was prohibited, we were waiting for revelation to come from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to the Prophet telling us not to do this. So the author says that when the wahy, when the revelation was quiet about certain things, that means it's a sign that it's not mahzur, it's not prohibited, it's not, impermissible, right? And that they are in a state of, they can relax, they can continue to do this, whatever practice it is, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not prohibit it. And he says this is the fiqh of the Sahaba, because this is a quotation by Jabir ibn Abdullah, not by the Prophet, but basically this is the fiqh of the Sahaba, meaning this is the understanding of the Sahaba, radhiyallahu anhum, may Allah be pleased with them all, how they understood this. And so to conclude this principle, right, we said what's the principle? The principle is the original ruling when it comes to matters is that it is permissible, right? That's the principle. And so you understand from this, right, that al-ibadah, acts of worship, can only be set based on revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But aada, meaning habits, routine actions, and muamala, meaning interactions, that can only be haram, can be impermissible when there is revelation about that. Right? So this is ruling or principle number 1. Principle number 2, which we will dive in today, inshallah, and try to conclude for today's session with principle number 2, inshallah, and if Allah permits, we'll do the other principles next time. But we want to kind of also give you an opportunity to ask questions, and I want to ask you a few questions as well to try to discuss a few points, inshallah, before we conclude. So here, principle number 2 says, التحليل والتحريم حق الله وحده. Okay, so what's this principle? It means that the only one that has the right to make something impermissible, to make something haram, or to make something halal, permissible, it is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is the right of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. Right? So the author says here, Shaykh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, he says, Islam came and it specified, right, the authority of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in setting that which is haram and setting that which is halal, that which is permissible and that which is impermissible, right? And removed this right or this authority from the hands of people, no matter their status in terms of their knowledge, no matter their status in terms of how close they are to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It was removed from them and it was given or set into to be of the rights of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. فَلَا أَحْبَارَ أَوْ رُهْبَانَ, no priests, no monks, right? وَلَا مُلُوكَ أَوْ سَلَاطِينَ, no kings, no sultans, right, have the right to make something impermissible, right, upon the servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or to make something permissible upon the servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He says, وَمَنْ فَعَلَ ذَلِكَ مِنْهُمْ فَقَدْ تَجَاوَزَ حَدَّهُ وَأَعْتَدَى عَلَى حَقِّ الرُّبُوبِيَّةِ فِي التَّشْرِيعِ لِلْخَلْقِ. Whoever does anything like that, then they have transgressed, and they have taken away from the rights and the due and the authority of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in setting legislation for creation. وَمَنْ رَضِيَ بِعَمَلَهُمْ هَذَا وَاتَّبَعَهُ فَقَدْ جَعَلَهُمْ شُرَكَاءَ لِلَّهِ وَاعْتَبَرَ أَتْبَعَهُ هَذَا شِرْكًا. اتباعه هذا واعتبر شركا. So what is the author saying here? He says whoever accepts this action coming from priests or monks or kings or sultans or governments or prime ministers or presidents, right? Whoever accepts this action from them and follows them upon it, then they have actually associated them with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and their action, their following of such authorities becomes shirk, becomes associating partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then he quotes a verse in the Quran, أَمْ لَهُمْ شُرَكَاءُ شَرَعُوا لَهُم مِّنَ الدِّينِ مَا لَمْ يَأْذَنْ بِهِ اللَّهُ. And this is in Surah Ash-Shura. And again, I want to pull up the translation from by Mustafa Khattab because it is that's the clear Quran. Here it is. أَمْ لَهُمْ شُرَكَاءُ شَرَعُوا لَهُم مِّنَ الدِّينِ مَا لَمْ يَأْذَنْ بِهِ اللَّهُ. Translated as, or do they have associate gods who have ordained for them some beliefs which Allah has not authorized? Right. So this is the translation by in the clear Quran. And so the idea is that this is condemned by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right. Condemned by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala condemns the actions of Ahlul Kitab, the people of the book, who put authority, right, when it comes to making that which is permissible, or setting what is permissible for them, or making or setting what is impermissible, they put it in the hands of their monks and their priests. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala condemns this. He says, اتخذوا أحبارهم ورهبانا أربابا من دون الله. Right? And so this verse is a very interesting verse, and it is, I believe, in Surah Al-Tawbah. In Surah Al-Tawbah, that's also, I think, in Surah Al-Imran. But in Surah Al-Tawbah, Allah Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that they have taken their priests, right? Their priests. Here it is. أحبارهم ورهبانهم أربابا من دون الله. This concept of taking priests and monks as arbab, right? The word arbab is used, and arbab is the plural of rabb, meaning lords. They've taken them as lords. Here it is. They have taken their rabbis and their monks, as well as al-Masih ibn Maryam, the Messiah, the son of Mary, as lords besides Allah, even though they were commanded to worship none but one God. The continuation of the verse: اتخذوا أحبارهم ورهبانهم أربابا من دون الله والمسيح ابن مريم وما أمروا إلا ليعبدوا إلها واحدا لا إله إلا هو سبحانه عما يشركون. There is no God other or worthy of worship except Him. Glorified is He above what they associate with Him. And there's a narration that a man came to the Prophet ﷺ, and his name is Adi ibn Hatim al-Ta'i. So Adi, he was actually Christian. Okay, so Adi, he came to the Prophet ﷺ, and he heard this verse. And he said, Ya Rasulullah, we don't worship them, right? We don't take them as lords. The priests, the monks, the rabbis, we don't take them as lords. And the Prophet responded to him, and this is narrated in Sunan Tirmidhi. The Prophet responded and he says, Bala, no, in fact you have. إنهم حرموا الحلال. They made impermissible that which is permissible, the halal. وأحلوا لهم الحرام. And they made halal, or permissible, that which is haram, that which is impermissible, meaning they kind of, reversed the situation of things. فاتبعوهم, and they followed them. فذلك عبادتهم إياهم. That was the worship that they had given to them. Okay, so this is a very interesting narration. And the Prophet is also reported to have explained this verse further, and he says, أما أنهم لم يكونوا يعبدونهم ولكنهم كانوا إذا أحلوا لهم شيئا استحلوه وإذا حرموا عليهم شيئا حرموه. The Prophet is reported to have explained the verse saying, it was not that they worshipped them, like, bowed down to them or prayed to them, the priests and the monks. It's not that they worshipped them as such, but that they took what they said in terms of saying that which is permissible, impermissible, or making that which is impermissible as permissible. They took it and they followed them when it came to it. And so this is, kind of the condemnation in the Quran when it comes to this, right? That the right, the duty, the authority is only in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make that which is permissible, permissible, and make that which is impermissible, impermissible. Only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has that authority. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala condemns this again in the Quran in Surah Yunus. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, قُلْ أَرَأَيْتُمْ مَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ لَكُمْ مِنْ رِزْقٍ فَجَعَلْتُمْ مِنْهُ حَرَامًا وَحَلَالًا قُلْ اللَّهُ أَذِنَ لَكُمْ أَمْ عَلَى اللَّهِ تَفْتَرُونَ. So say to them, have you seen, this is just my humble translation, have you seen what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed to you of His rizq, of His provisions, and then you made from it haram and halal? Say to them, did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give you permission to do this? Or against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala you are falsifying, right? You're taftarun ala Allah, meaning you're saying things against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You're saying that this is from Allah, but it isn't, right? And this is, there are numerous verses like this, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that, kind of reserved this right to Himself. Imam al-Shafi'i, in his very key book named that's one of his key books, he says the following. He talks about al-Qadi Abi Yusuf. Okay, so he talks about Abu Yusuf, who is a companion or a friend of Abu Hanifa. He says, أدركت مشايخنا من أهل العلم يكرهون الفتيا. So Imam Shafi'i says, I witnessed from my shuyukh, from my teachers, that they disliked to give fatwas, they disliked to issue decrees or verdicts, right? To say هذا حلال وهذا حرام. They disliked to do this. إلا ما كان في كتاب الله, right? Except that which is clearly in the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. بينا بلا تفسير, which is clear and obvious, not in need of further interpretation, right? So he says, حدثنا ابن السائب عن الربيع ابن خيثم وكان من أفضل التابعين. So one of the tabi'in, one of the followers of the Sahaba, meaning the next generation after the companions of the Prophet, he said, and he was amongst the best of the tabi'in, he said, إياكم أن يقول الرجل إن الله أحل هذا أو رضيه فيقول الله له لم أحل هذا ولم أرضه. أو يقول إن الله حرم هذا فيقول الله كذبت لم أحرمه ولم أنهى عنه. So he says, this is Ibn Sa'ib, one of the tabi'een, one of the followers of the companions, meaning the next generation after the companions. He is reported to have said, and Imam al-Shafi'i talks about him and says that he was from Afdal al-Tabi'een, was from amongst the best of the tabi'een. He said, beware that a man amongst you would say, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made this permissible, or has accepted this. And then Allah would say to him, meaning on the Day of Judgment, I did not make this permissible, nor did I accept it. And beware that some of you would say, or a man would say, Allah has prohibited this. And then Allah would say, you lie. I did not prohibit this, right? Nor did I prevent it. And so the Imam Shafi'i continues, and he says, Ibrahim al-Nakha'i. Ibrahim al-Nakha'i is also from the Tabi'een, and he's from the fuqaha, from the scholars of the Tabi'een. And he would say to his companions, أنهم كانوا إذا أفتوا بشيء أو نهوا عنه قالوا هذا مكروه وهذا لا بأس به. Right? فأما أن نقول هذا حلال وهذا حرام فما أعظم هذا. So Ibrahim al-Nakha'i would say that when the people would come and ask about fatwa, him and other scholars like him, they would say this is disliked and this is, there's no problem in this, right? But to say halal and haram, that is something great. That's a high level, right? That we can't just say. And Ibn Taymiyyah is also reported to have said أن السلف لم يطلقوا الحرام إلا على ما علم تحريمه قطعا. That as-salaf, meaning the predecessors, the righteous predecessors, would say something is haram only about something that they know for sure, unequivocally, is haram. وهكذا نجد إماما كأحمد بن حنبل. Ahmad ibn Hanbal as well is reported to have said يسأل عن الأمر. He would be asked about something. فيقول أكرهه. He would say I dislike it. أو لا يعجبني, or I don't like it. Right? I dislike it or I don't like it. أو لا أحبه, or I don't love it. أو لا أستحسنه, or I don't think it's good. Right? So this is the response of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, and he's of course the pioneer of fiqh al-Hanbali. And so the author says, ومثل هذا يروى عن مالك وأبي حنيفة وسائر الأئمة رضي الله عنهم. Like this is reported about all of the A'imma and all of the scholars from Malik to Abu Hanifa, and all of them, they would say all of this. The author puts a footnote about this, and that's kind of the conclusion of this principle. He says, this is so that blind followers who jump and rush to use the word haram without having actual evidence, right, or even something similar to evidence to prove this verdict that they're giving, to know that this is not the right way to go, right? So that they know that this is not the right way to go. The next principle, inshallah, if Allah permits, next time we will touch upon and dive into detail and share some comments about, inshallah, is تحريم الحلال وتحليل الحرام قرين الشرك بالله. The principle translates to making haram that which is permissible, and making halal that which is impermissible is, qareen, meaning it's just like ash-shirku billah, just like associating partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's principle number 3, which we will touch upon next time, inshallah, if Allah permits. We want to kind of open the floor for comments, questions, reflections, thoughts, and maybe even points of disagreement. The reason why we're covering these principles and maybe going a little slow in them is to recognize that there is a methodology. There are principles that are set by our scholars, and they are done in such a fashion so that we be guided in how we come to conclusions about what is permissible and what is not. Any thoughts, comments, or reflections? All right, so there's a good question here. 2 questions. One question says, does the difference of opinion when it comes to the obligation of niqab fall under that which Allah has not talked about? So that's a very, very good question. So the answer is no. And that's the short answer. The long answer is that difference of opinion does not necessarily come because Allah did not talk about it. So nobody can actually unequivocally say that Allah did not talk about niqab. Now, perhaps the word niqab wasn't used, but likewise, the word hijab wasn't used in the context that we use today, right? So niqab, hijab, these are words that we use today. But in the Quran, they're not used as such. In fact, the word hijab is used in a different setting. The word niqab was used by the Prophet ﷺ, which shows that niqab was present at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. And when something is present at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and he did not speak against it, that means the least we can say, or sorry, let's say, the least we can say about niqab, right? Not the most, the least we can say about it was that it is approved by the Prophet ﷺ, that he did not say, don't do this, right? Because this is called iqrar al-Rasul ﷺ, right? So the word niqab actually did exist at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, not in the Quran, but in the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. The word niqab is said to exist specifically when it comes to performing Hajj and Umrah, where the Prophet said that our sisters, our women, should not be wearing the niqab during Hajj and Umrah, right? So that's the word niqab right there. So the idea here is that the question that arises, the difference of opinion about niqab, is whether it is obligatory or not, right? So those that say that it is not obligatory, they say it is approved by the Prophet ﷺ, and it existed at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and it is permissible. In fact, they can even go as far as saying it is even recommended. Or if somebody does wear the niqab, then they are attaining higher piety and higher status, and they're doing something that is inshallah rewarding, right? The question, the difference of opinion arises whether it is an obligation or not. And that is because there's no clear text that says that it is an obligation, unequivocally. Now, there is a little bit of ambiguity about the text, because when it says, yudnina alayhinna bikhumurihin, when they lower their khimars, which is the head covering, when they lower it on themselves, on them, the women, that's the command. Is it above their faces? Is it to cover their faces, or is it from the sides and allows the face to be seen? And we also have other hadith where the Prophet says that nothing from a woman can be seen the moment she reaches of age except hada wa hada, and he points to his hands and his face. So the face and the hands is what is allowed to be seen. So some scholars take that hadith and say that it is not very authentic. There are more authentic hadith that talk about the understanding of the women at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, that they actually wore the niqab than what we call the niqab today, and they were covering their faces and covering their head covering, and only time when it was seen was during Hajj and Umrah, right? So that's the discussion that scholars have. So difference of opinion sometimes happens when the text is not equivocal, right? There's difference of opinion about it. Now, Shaykh al-Qaradawi takes the opinion that niqab is not a fadl, it is good to have, nice to have. Somebody that does it out of piety and seeking reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, inshallah, will be rewarded for it. But if someone does not wear the niqab, they are not sinful. Somebody wears the hijab, in other words, proper hijab, but face and hands are seen, then that is they're done what is required of them, and as such, niqab is kind of going the extra mile. That's the opinion of Shaykh al-Qaradawi, and I lean towards that as well. That niqab is not. There's lots of discussion about the niqab per se, but we're not going into it now. But just to answer the question, is it because Allah did not talk about it, right? And the answer is no. It's not because Allah did not talk about it, because Allah did talk about it, but the verses are understood in a different way, right? So sometimes you have a verse that is, has a little bit of room for interpretation, and so here is where a difference of opinion arises, even amongst the Sahaba. And a good example of that is when the Prophet said something, ﷺ. So he said, the very famous hadith where he said, go towards Bani Qurayza and do not pray Asr until you reach there, right? So the Sahaba were already wearing their armor, were already in a state of war, and he told them, we're going to continue, we're going to march, we're going to head to Bani Qurayza to rid al-Medina of them, because they were treacherous and they betrayed us, and they opened the southern gates of Medina for the disbelievers to come and attack us during the siege of Medina, right? During Ghazwat al-Ahzab, the battle of the trench, or the battle of the Allies, the Confederates, sometimes called, right? So he said, now that the Confederates ran away because of the storm and the rain, we are going to turn our attention to Bani Qurayza. So march towards Bani Qurayza, do not pray Asr until you reach there. لا يصلين العصر أحدكم حتى بني قريظة, till we reach Bani Qurayza. So the Sahaba marched. They went towards Bani Qurayza. And as they were marching, a group of them realized that if they continue to march till Bani Qurayza, they will miss Asr, and then Maghrib will come. And so a group of them said, okay, guys, let's pray Asr, and then we will continue our march. Another group said, no, the Prophet said, don't pray Asr. So even if we miss Asr, we're going to pray it when we get there. We'll pray it late, because that's what the Prophet said. So the two opinions existed. One group said, no, the Prophet said it really just to encourage us to march right away. That was the essence, the meaning of what he said. Don't take it literally. The other group said, no, we're going to take it literally, and we're going to pray Asr when we reach Bani Qurayza, even if that means missing the time of Asr. So both groups did this, right? One group did that, one group did this. And the narration says the Prophet did not say who was right or who was wrong. Second, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was quiet. This is known that the Prophet accepted the difference of opinion, right? So this is an example that is highlighted that when something is said, it could be interpreted in different ways sometimes, right? And as such, there's room for that difference of opinion. And the Prophet approved both. He did not, kind of say this was right or this was wrong. And so this is just given as an example of how sometimes difference of opinion arises, and we'll touch upon that in more detail later on, inshallah, for the permits. There was a question asked, why has the attitude changed recently? So maybe clarify, what do you mean attitude? Do you mean what to decide what is halal and haram? Clarify that, inshallah, and we can come to that answer. All right, there was another question. What is the standard for an explicit wording? I heard that it is the final verse in the prohibition of khamr. So that's a very good question. This is something that even scholars differ about, like, what is considered explicit and what is considered, not as explicit. Scholars differ about that as well, right? And that's why, for some things, sometimes scholars say, no, it's not as haram, or it is, it's makruh, or, for certain things, they might differ about these things, right? And we'll see, as we go through the book, inshallah, we'll see, are these standards highlighted? What is considered qat'i, right? Like, clear cut. How do we define qat'i? How do we define what is unequivocal or what is clear cut, right? And so we'll come to that, inshallah, in the book, if Allah permits, inshallah. And yes, the attitude, why people easily say haram. That's a very good question. Okay, so that's the question. Why has the attitude of people saying things are haram, why has it changed recently? I think it's because we live in a haram world, to put it lightly. The world today, subhanAllah, is filled with so many haram things. We're bombarded with haram left, right, and center. Especially if we live in the West, we live in haram. And so unfortunately, what happens is to be safe, to play it safe. And sometimes that is the right course of action, by the way. We stay away from things, right? We say, this is just haram, just stay away from it, brother, right? This is, oh no, haram, stay away from it, just to stay clear from things, to be on the safe side of things. And there is merit to this, there's actually I don't know if it's a principle of fiqh, but there's at least an understanding called daru shubuhat, right? And daru shubuhat means to close the door to the things that are doubtful, right? To close the door to the things that are doubtful. So out of closing the door for the things that are doubtful, daru shubuhat, sometimes scholars take a little bit more liberty to say it's haram, right? So it may not be 100% haram, it may just be, a small percentage of it is haram, but to play it safe and to, stay clear from that which is haram, they say it's haram. And sometimes people that are not scholars, they actually come to conclusions like this, that it is haram because perhaps it has a percentage of that which is haram, right? And so a question, of course, arises, how much is an acceptable percentage of haram in something, right? And so that is also a difference of opinion, but we'll touch upon later on, inshallah. But point is, the world we live in is just filled with haram, and people, out of their fear of falling into haram, they try to play it safe. So we should recognize that there is sincerity in their attitude. It's not just that they want to be stringent or hardline extremists that are just frowning all the time and evil. It's not like that, right? Sure, maybe there are some people that are like that, but the general sentiment comes out of sincerity, right? That kind of comes out of this keenness to avoid that which could lead to haram. Like, even if it isn't haram per se, it could open the door to it. It's too close to the borderline, right? And so they try to have a safe distance and try to avoid it. There's, interestingly, a very famous hadith of the Prophet ﷺ where he says, "Al-halalu bayin wal-haramu bayin, wa baynahuma umurun mushtabihat." Halal is clear, haram is clear, and between them are matters that are mushtabihat. Mushtabihat could be translated as doubtful, controversial, confusing, right? This is what some scholars call the gray area, right? Halal is clear, haram is clear, black and white. There's the gray area in between. And in that same hadith, the Prophet says, فَمَنِ اتَّقَى الشُّبُهَاتِ فَقَدْ اسْتَبْرَأَ لِدِينِهِ وَعِرْضِهِ. Whoever avoids the doubtful, controversial gray area, they are actually able to declare the innocence of their deen and their honor. لِدِينِهِ وَعِرْضِهِ. These are the words of the Prophet. Whoever stays clear of the gray area, they are able to do this. And then he also says, then فَمَنْ حَامَ حَوْلَ الْحِمَى. Whoever kind of revolves around a protected area, who's always coming close to the protected or preserved area, يُوشِكُ أَنْ يَرْتَعَ فِيهِ. Eventually will fall into the protected or preserved area. أَلَا وَإِنَّ حِمَى اللَّهِ مَحَارِمُهُ. Right? The preserved or protected area that is prevented from us to enter is the maharim of Allah, the prohibited areas of Allah, what Allah prohibited. So basically the idea here is that when we come close to the prohibitions, when we walk nonchalant in the gray zone, so to speak, we might eventually, maybe mistakenly or unintentionally, fall into the haram. And so this is a hadith that actually talks about, very interestingly, the controversial areas, right? And this hadith is taken by most scholars to define what is known as wara, wawra'in. And wara is keenness to stay away from that which is doubtful, stay away from that which is controversial, even maybe let go of things that are halal. Why? To have a safer buffer zone between you and haram, right? And wara is a very good quality, right? People that have wara are people that are not keen to be at the borderline. You know, sometimes a young man once came to me and he said, you know, brother, tell me if it's halal or haram. I want to do only that which is all halal, and anything that's haram is what I'll avoid. But anything, you know, I want to be all the way up to the edge. So they even use that expression. I want to be all the way up to the edge. Just show me the borderline, right? The problem with that attitude is that you're very close to the borderline. If you step mistakenly, you might fall into it. And the analogy really is like when you're driving near the when you're driving on a road, you're on a lane, you try to be in the middle of the lane, right? If you're very close to one edge of the lane or the other, the right side or the left side, you easily could cross that line, right? You cross the line because you're so close to it. The moment, you know, just a small mistake happens and you veer a little bit to the left or to the right, you find yourself crossing the line, right? Crossing the lane. And driving out of your lane, while we should all stay in our lanes, as they say, right? So the idea here is that, you know, this is wara. Wara, some scholars, right, say that it is actually a command from the Prophet, right? Other scholars say, no, this hadith does not command wara. It says it is good to do, right? Whoever avoids the controversial areas, they are clearly identifying the innocence of their deen, of their way of life, and their honor, right? But he didn't say you have to do this. And that's the majority opinion about this hadith. So you can see, like, the same hadith, but difference of opinion about it. Like, is the Prophet saying we have to do this, or is the Prophet saying it's nice to do this, right? Good to do this, better to do this, right? And so both opinions exist, albeit one the majority and another the minority, but still the opinions exist, right? So this is kind of how different opinions exist. All right, there's a question here that says, we're not supposed to go looking for that which Allah has not made permissible or impermissible. But how does that search for what is permissible and impermissible change when conflicted with modern problems that aren't as clearly defined as halal and haram, such as with alcohol, especially when conflicting views from different scholars exist? So yeah, so excellent question, mashallah. This is a deep question, actually. And it kind of highlights a very important point, that we live in different times, and, you know, times change, and as times change, halal things pop up and haram things pop up, right? And so aren't we supposed to, like, know whether it's halal or haram? And an example is smoking. Now, smoking existed from long ago, but not in the form that we're kind of familiar with today, right? You know, cigarettes and you know, lighting at the end, and, you know, kind of puffing on it, and all that is kind of new. Not new to us, but, you know, when it came up, it was new. And so at the time, there were some people that said that it isn't haram, that it's maybe makruh because of the smell of the smoke, or maybe because you'll be in an area where others are not smoking and they're like smelling your smoke, so it's like, you know, you're annoying them, so it's makruh, it's like disliked, right? So that opinion actually existed about smoking until people started to die And so when people started to die, and lawsuits started to come up against the tobacco companies about how this product that they were selling, they thought it was harmless and didn't harm their health. They all of a sudden were dying because of cancer. And so now scholars stepped in and they said, okay, you know what, since it's killing people, and people are dying because of secondhand smoking, and people are dying because they are smoking, and there's so many diseases attributed to it, so it's haram, right? So this is an example of something new that came up, right? And things new like that will continue to come up, and we are supposed to, and by the way, maybe I should reword that, scholars are supposed to, kind of set, the things that are new and popping up and put them in the correct category of halal or haram, or it is in the doubtful gray area, right? And so, when something new pops up, like the example of smoking came up, scholars should have studied it, right? They should have brought in doctors, should have brought in professionals, and should have kind of studied the effects of it. They were a little late, because everybody was a little late when it came to smoking, because, like I said, for the longest time people thought smoking was fine and doesn't cause problems, and then only later on did people realize that it was harmful. But the moment it did, the moment people realized it, that's when scholars stepped in and said, okay, it's haram. It's not makruh anymore. It's not disliked just because of the smell. It's actually haram because of the dangers it causes to one's health, and our health is a trust from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we need to maintain our health, and it's haram to throw yourselves to destruction, or to kill yourselves, or to cause bodily harm to yourselves. So as such, by extension, smoking becomes haram. So this is just an example, but now in our modern days, we have what is known as union of scholars, right? Collective bodies. Like in the United States and Canada, we have the Fiqh Council of North America. There's also AMJA, right? The American Muslim Jurists Association. And so there are groups of scholars, and they existed in many parts of the world, these groups of scholars that sit together and try to, we have the European Council of Ifta, we have the International Union of Muslim Scholars. These are groups of scholars that try to sit on a regular basis, try to sift through the new things that happen in life, and try to put them in one category or the other. If there are differences of opinion about it, conflicting opinions sometimes about it, it remains in the gray zone, right? Because each conflicting opinion has grounds, and it has kind of what they call qiyas, that they measure based on, or they kind of come close to, or they relate to. They say this is like this, so that's why they base it on Quran and Sunnah. So Quran and Sunnah says something, and then they say, this is like that. And so since this is doing that, and Quran and Sunnah is clear about this makes it halal, or this makes it haram. And sometimes there are difference of opinions about certain things, right? The point here is that if someone is on his own or her own saying that this is halal or this is haram, it doesn't give much weight to that opinion, right? But when you have a group of scholars, especially if they're very well versed, very knowledgeable, then you have more weight. So us as lay people, I say, we do have to search for that which is permissible and impermissible, right? But we rely on two things. We rely on what is clear cut in the Quran, and we rely on what scholars tell us, because the scholars will rely on what is in the Quran. Basically, what is known as qiyas, or measuring, or comparing, or making something kind of similar to something that may exist in the Quran and the Sunnah. This is something scholars can do, not us, because we lack the tools needed for it, right? And when it's a group of scholars that are doing it, that gives it more weight. And when that group of scholars, it has more credibility. The greater the credibility of the scholars, the stronger the weight of the fatwa, right? So, for example, what do we do as lay people? What do I do? Let's put it that way. When it comes to something that's halal and haram, I look at who is saying what about it, right? Who are they? Now, this is just as important as the message itself. Why? Because the person lends credibility to their message, right? So if there's a research paper about certain matters, who is that person? What is their background? What is their knowledge? What is their expertise? Are they, unfortunately, as there are many, from ulama sultan, from the people that are pretty much serving the interests of governments and powers that be, or are they independent? Do they go against the grain even at their own peril? Are they brave enough to say the truth regardless of difficulties that comes to themselves? All of this lends credence and credibility to the scholar that speaks, right? And so, personally, this is why I consider Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi to be one of the most highly credible scholars of our time, rahimahullah, because he went against the grain and he faced exile because of it. He couldn't go to Egypt anymore. He was Egyptian, but he had to live in Qatar for the most of his life, and so he paid a price, right? Somebody that does this is somebody that has credibility, and of course, he's not alone. He has, alhamdulillah, was part of a union of scholars, many of whom are kind of in a similar situation where they spoke truth to power at their own peril, right? Sheikh al-qaradawi, Sheikh Ali al-Salabi, and many others, right, that are part of unions and part of, ifta councils that studied things at length and gave issues and gave verdicts about certain matters. So, in other words, in short, it's not that we're not supposed to search, right? We are supposed to search, but we rely on trusted scholars because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Ask the people of knowledge if you do not know. And we trust that we ask them also for their references, for their research, for their evidence. We don't just take their words blindly. And this is because there are modern issues that are popping up all the time from time to time and that we need guidance about, right? Alcohol is clear-cut, you're right, but there are things that pop up, from time to time that do require a little bit more research and a little bit more studying, and we rely on our scholars when it comes to that. All right, there's a question here that says, how can you tell when you have a difference of opinion with someone versus when you are associating a superstition with a matter? That's a very interesting question. Superstition with a matter. Superstition is not in the Quran and the Sunnah, right? So this is, you recognize that immediately from the get-go, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has removed superstition, right? Which is in the Quran, it's called tatayyur, right? That you become superstitious, you become, somebody that believes in good luck charms and believes in all that stuff. So, when you have an opinion about a matter, like I said, you kind of look at the validity of it. How do you recognize the validity of the opinion? You recognize that it's a sound argument. It's made based on the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. It is, quoting verses from the Quran, quoting a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. The argument that is perhaps from the scholar, him or herself, is in line with the Quran and the Sunnah that's being quoted, right? And you also don't look at one person alone, because this is perhaps what some people do today. They call it fatwa shopping, right? They search and search and search till they find the fatwa that meets, their criteria and is in line with their, hawa, with their whims and desires, and they say, aha, here's a fatwa, I'm going to follow it. And regardless of who said it, it could be Sheikh Google for all I care, right? And so that's unfortunately not the right attitude. I think that we need to look at the fatwa itself and look at the person, or better, persons behind the fatwa. The more people behind the fatwa, the more credible it is. The more educated those people are, the more credible it is. The more, honest and truthful these people are. They're willing to pay a price to go against the grain. There's no kind of doubt into their, allegiance to people of power, as opposed to their allegiance to the truth. All that lends more credibility to the opinion, right? So that's kind of how you decipher an opinion in general. And it would not have superstition, because superstition is not part of our deen, alhamdulillah rabbil alameen, and we don't believe in anything that is superstitious, and all of that we alhamdulillah, the Quran came to remove, right, from our understandings. All right, there's a question that says, how would you advise or maybe console someone who fears the gray area and the commands that have difference of opinion to the point that it makes them freak out if they fall into it? And so this is the good thing about what we're talking about today, is that the gray area, according to the majority of opinion, is not sinful area. Okay, so if you fall into the gray area, you're not sinful. You can choose to stay clear of gray area, and that is commendable. That is rewarded. That is highly rewarded. Like I said, it's called wara. If you attain wara, or do wara in your actions, in your lifestyle, then you're doing good. You're doing a good thing, right? But if you don't, if you fall into the gray area, you need to just be careful. This is really how it is. SubhanAllah. What's taqwa? Taqwa is to be careful, right? And it's very interesting how Abdullah ibn Mas'ud had defined taqwa to Umar ibn Khattab. Umar ibn Khattab, at one point in time, while he was the Khalifa, the leader of the believers, he asked the Sahaba, he said, "Oh, companions of the Prophet, tell me, how could you define taqwa? How do you define piety?" And so Abdullah ibn Mas'ud gave the definition. He said, "Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, O leader of the believers, isn't it the case that when you walk into an area that has thorns and spikes and might be a dangerous area to walk into, you lift your thawb, you hold on to your garment, you lift it up a little bit, and you tread carefully." And Umar ibn Khattab said, "Yes, that's right. If I walk into such an area, I would do just that." And then Abdullah ibn Mas'ud says, كَذَلِكَ التَّقْوَى. Likewise is taqwa. Taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not just a feeling in the heart, right? It's also how we govern our lives. We govern our lives in a way that we tread in this world carefully. We're careful where we step. We're careful where we put our foot. We're careful what we say. We're careful what we do. We're careful what we look at, right? We want to do all of these things in a way that is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We're keen on avoiding anything that displeases Allah. We're keen on avoiding the traps of the shaitan, and there are many. So when somebody goes about a business venture, right, they check, they research. The person I'm doing a business with, that I'm going to trust my money with, right? They always do that research, and that's natural, right? Because you're entrusted your hard-earned money with this person or in this venture. Likewise, we should do such research when it comes to everything else in our lives, right? Is this pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Should be part of our research criteria, right? When you come to enroll in university, is this field of study pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Are the details in that field of study pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or displeasing? Right? And so these are the questions we should ask ourselves, and that is to avoid the gray area, to avoid the haram, which is impermissible, and to try to do our best to do just that, right? Avoiding the gray area is the safer route, and it is the more rewarding route. But if somebody falls into the gray area, we need to recognize that, let's just not make a habit of this, right? Let's not make a habit of this. Why? Because when we habitually fall into the gray area and we become so comfortable in it, then we're teetering on the edge. We're coming too close to the haram, right? So this is an advice, by the way, because, like I said, there is a bit of difference of opinion about the gray area, but it's just understanding about this. All right, there's another question that says, when was the difference, when there is a difference of opinion, and both opinions are based on evidence, Quran, Sahih Hadith, how do sheikhs and imams take a position? That's a very great question, a wonderful question. If there is equal weight to both opinions, then that means this is, as the scholars would say, amrun fihi sa'. This is a matter that allows for the difference of opinion to exist. But it allows for both opinions to be valid. We can take this opinion and the other one is valid. It doesn't have to be an attitude of intolerance. In other words, we can accept and tolerate the difference of opinion on matters, right? And so this is the idea, that when there's a difference of opinion about this matter, we can tolerate it and accept it. And some may say that this is, not the best way to go. Others say, no, it's okay. There's nothing wrong with it. Two different opinions, as long as they're valid, they're evidence-based, there's credibility to the people delivering the message and delivering these fatwas. And so we understand from this that we, alhamdulillah, both are valid opinions, and we respect both opinions, even if one you lean towards. Right? Scholars say there's a hadith, I'm not sure actually about the authenticity of it, maybe somebody can check. It says, "Istafti qalbaka wa in aftawk," meaning, reach into your heart and ask it for the fatwa, even if others give you the fatwa. Now, this does not mean that you come up with your own verdicts and your own edicts and your own decrees and your own decisions on matters, saying, "Oh, this is halal. I made fatwa to my heart, and my heart said it's halal." No, that's not what it means. But it means that when you reach the point where you have more than one fatwa with kind of equal weight, that's perhaps where you ask your heart, which is more closer, do you think, to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, more pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And you try to do that. Perhaps it could be a question of which has more wara to it, right? Then that means that's more recommended to do. Both are correct opinions, both are valid opinions, both you can do, but one has more wara to it. That means one is more rewarding, right? So it's things like that, right, that you try to decipher and base your answer upon. Oh, a question here, what was the name of the most credible scholar that you mentioned? The most credible scholar, that's a very interesting question. There are many credible scholars in our times. Sheikh al-qaradawi is one, rahimahullah, of course. He passed away 2 years ago, a great loss really for the ummah. Sheikh Muhammad Hassan Wald al-Dadaw, a Mauritanian scholar, I personally consider him the top scholar of our time. But there are many scholars of our time, subhanAllah. And I think the best way to go is to look at councils, not just one scholar, but councils of scholars, like groups of scholars. So the European Council of Fatwa, is a very good fatwa counselor. Group of scholars that are there are very credible, very reliable, I think. And that council issues, kind of a yearly report and yearly, digest, I think, of different fatwas that is worth considering and worth reading into. And so, it's a matter of asking. There's certain websites that are very good, by the way, to check out, and to reach out to. Islam Web is one of them. I think I consider Islam Web to be very reliable, very trustworthy. Islam QA is also one of them. I believe there are two Islam QAs, but one is the .org. That's a little bit not the best out there, like you have to be a little bit careful when it comes to that. But Islam QA, I think .com. No, it's not IslamQA.com. So let's see, Islam QA. What's Islam QA? What is the website? .info. There we go. IslamQA.info. The one that established that website is Sheikh Saleh Al-Munajjid. Sheikh Muhammad Saleh Al-Munajjid, Hafidhullah, may Allah preserve him and release him from prison. I heard he's in prison. And I consider him to be one of my teachers. I was blessed with the opportunity to study at his hands a few years back. And so that is a website definitely to consider. IslamQA.info. Also, Islam Web, right? There's also .net, a very wonderful website. These are two websites that I recommend, and that are worth considering, inshallah. There's a question here that says, is there a difference between fatwa shopping and checking for different opinions to form a more informed opinion? Absolutely, there's a difference. Fatwa shopping, I define it as, maybe someone else has a better definition, as searching for the fatwa that your heart desires, right? Like that is the what I think fatwa shopping. Like, you're not really researching. You're not being honest. You're not being sincere. You're just searching for a fatwa that meets your heart's desires. It's like you've kind of predetermined what your decision is. Right? You're like, you know what? I think it's halal, bro. Right? And then you're like researching. Who said it's halal? This people said it's haram. No. Exclude them. Haram. No. Ignore. Halal. Allahu Akbar. I found someone that said it's halal. This is it. That's the opinion. Who's this person? Oh, it's Muhammad Ali. There it is. Muhammad Ali is my scholar. Right? So that's the attitude of a fatwa shopper, I think. And so the idea is that, that shouldn't be the attitude. Our search should be for the truth, regardless of what our heart desires. It's not about what we want. It's about what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordained. And so even if it goes against the grain, right, even if it goes against what we think is best, then that should be, I think, the way to go. That's the search for different opinions, to be informed, to research, to study, to compare opinions. Like that's commendable, inshallah. But I mean, and it's different than fatwa shopping. Allah. The second scholar, I think you mean, Muhammad Hassan al-Dabdu, Hafidhullah. So he's a Mauritanian scholar that I highly recommend. Islam Online is a good website, although Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi has not been associated with it for a long time. But yes, it does have a lot of great things on Islam Online as well. Yes, that's a good website as well. Barakallahu fikum. Jazakumullah khair. I hope I didn't take too much of your time. I hope this was beneficial. We hope to, meet again, inshallah, next week, and we go into the other principles of Ibn and again, open the floor for comments and questions. If you found this beneficial and relevant, please share your feedback with Dawah Canada and let them know, what you thought about it and what you'd like to improve. And, you can reach out to me, inshallah, anytime. I'm available, by the way, via WhatsApp. And just to give you my number, in case you want to reach out to me, this is in the chat. I typically hand out my number to anybody. Don't call me because I don't answer calls, but I definitely do answer and respond to, WhatsApp messages. So if you have a question, you can reach out to me via WhatsApp, inshallah, and, ask for the questions or share feedback. You can say you hated this. You can say you liked it. You can say whatever you like, inshallah. And I will, inshallah, share the PowerPoint next time. I'll share the PowerPoint for this session and for the next, inshallah. So you'll have that available to you, bi'idhnillah. Again, forgive me for any mistakes and shortcomings on my side. They are my own. Anything good I said is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. Barakallahu fikum. Wa jazakumullahu khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakumullahu khairan, Sheikh, for the great talk and much beneficial information. And inshallah, we'll see everyone again next week. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum assalam.